Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Joe Micallef, historian and military analyst. After a little more than a week, how has the Russia-Ukraine crisis been playing out? And what does that mean for China? He sheds light on all that and more. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
And so the Russia-Ukraine invasion, it's been a little over a week. So how do you see it playing out?
I think you can characterize the conflict so far as having two phases, and we're on the cusp of the third phase. So phase one, let's call that Plan A, was to strike Ukraine with overwhelming force across four axes of advance, with the intention that that would essentially collapse the Ukrainian military, at the same time attacking Kiev, with the intention of either killing or capturing Zelensky and the members of his government, or causing them to flee. And as a result of that, then filling the resulting power vacuum with a Russian-sponsored, pro-Russian government of national unity that would take over, immediately ask the Russians for a ceasefire, and essentially bring the conflict to an end relatively quickly. That was Plan A. Plan A didn't work. In that sense, the Ukrainians won that round. The Ukrainian military did not collapse. In fact, it put up a pretty spirited fight. The Zelensky government wasn't killed or captured, nor did they flee, and instead they rallied the country, and by extension, the rest of the world. So that's now given to Plan B, which is an expansion of the conflict, the addition of more troops, and direct attacks on civilian infrastructure in the cities. Now, it's not clear whether that's a specific intention of the Russian plan, or whether that's just sloppiness as the Russians have increased the scale and tempo of their operations. But that's clearly happening. So now we're basically in that phase where the Russians are attacking the cities, have increased the tempo of operations. And we're probably on the cusp of phase three, which is that the Ukrainian army falls back to defend the cities and eventually enters the cities, and the Russians essentially surround and then besiege Ukraine's principal cities. And possibly, and it's not clear what happens at that point, but possibly even attack those cities. Now, if that happens, then you are talking about a horrendous scale of urban warfare that will likely culminate with what will go down in history as the Battle of Kiev. And you're talking about Russians essentially fighting their way into the cities, block by block, building by building, with horrendous civilian casualties. And it will be like Stalingrad or the siege of the Warsaw Ghetto, only filmed in real time, going out all over the World Wide Web. Plan D, which is always a possibility, but which has not yet happened, is some kind of a negotiated settlement that would bring the conflict to a close. And that's always a possibility. But as it stands now, there's really nothing in the offing. So that's pretty much where we are now. And let me just add as an aside, there is an enormous amount of propaganda coming out of Ukraine regarding the Ukrainian war, on both sides. So you have to take a lot of what's getting reported with a grain of salt. The Ukrainians are losing the war. They are putting up a valiant defense, but they are losing the war, and they will lose the war because the power that is arrayed against them is going to be overwhelming. They are winning the propaganda war, and they are doing that very effectively. Video of mothers clutching their children in subway stations while the Russians bomb the city, or grandmothers hoisting, AK-47s, makes for very compelling and powerful visual imagery, which definitely pulls at the heartstrings of the West. But this is just propaganda. I mean, grannies with AK-47s are not going to win this war for Ukraine. And if they try to stop the Russians, they're going to get killed very quickly. But certainly, Ukraine is winning that aspect of the war.
You mentioned earlier the kind of propaganda and disinformation that's on both sides this time around, and also the public sentiment. So how does that tie into it? Like, how has all the coverage really played into international politics and the response?
What's different about this war, what is unprecedented, is that this is a war that is being fought in real time across social media. And that has never happened before. And that has been one of the factors that has galvanized public opinion as extensively as it has. And there's risks in that. Yesterday, for example, the Longshoremen's Union, the ILWU, announced that they would not handle Russian cargoes. They would not unload Russian ships or handle Russian cargoes, either loading or unloading, at 29 West Coast ports. Now, that's dangerous because sanctions are essentially a form of economic warfare. The idea of a people's choice sanctions regime is just not a very good idea. And the United States and the EU and NATO have not sanctioned Russian shipping. They've not sanctioned Russian freight. But effectively, you have a longshoremen's union that says, "Well, we're going to do it, and we're not going to unload Russian ships anymore." So, and this is a pattern that's developing, not just with respect to the ports, but all over the world. You have companies pulling back from Russia, minimizing or ending economic relations with Russia and Russian companies. That is going beyond the sanctions that were initially imposed by Europe and the U.S. And this is a dangerous development because sanctions are essentially a form of economic warfare. And it's important that the West makes it clear to the Kremlin that these are the sanctions we're going to impose. These are the conditions under which those sanctions will be removed. These are the additional sanctions that will be imposed if your behavior doesn't change, and so forth. And as I said, this idea of kind of a people's choice sanctions regime is just not a very good idea. And, it risks governments losing control of the process. And remember, in all of this, the idea is to not necessarily punish Russia, but to make the cost of their actions prohibitively high, that they will change their behavior. So you need to make sure that you leave them a way out. Otherwise, all you're doing is backing a very powerful opponent into a corner. And that's just not a very good strategy.
So speaking of those sanctions and kind of backing Russia into a corner, it seems like a lot of Russian banks and institutions are now turning to China for help economically.
The Chinese angle is hard to put it's hard to read right now because initially there's no question that Beijing supported the Russian invasion. The summit in Beijing between Putin and Xi, they made it very clear that there was nothing between them, nothing that they couldn't cooperate on, etc. And I think it's pretty clear that the Chinese government had advance notice of what the Russian intention was, and were prepared to support it. I think Beijing has been surprised by how the rest of the world has responded. By the outpouring of support on social media, and I think more importantly by the boycott of Russian goods, which, while is relatively irrelevant to Russia and the Russian economy, were to be applied to China, would become very serious. And I think that's probably a greater threat right now in Beijing's eyes than any military response that the United States and its allies might undertake in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So I think China at the moment is backpedaling rather furiously, calling for diplomatic solutions. It has not yet volunteered or offered to mediate. That might happen, but I think for the moment they want to get as far away from this as possible and put as much distance between themselves and the Russians. And you've had Chinese banks and Chinese companies pull away a little bit, not a lot, but pull away from transactions with Russian companies and with the Russian state, and generally put some more distance. The big unknown here, and this is why the impact of the sanctions is going beyond what was originally intended by the U.S. and by the EU, is that no one knows what other sanctions might come. So no one wants to get caught on the wrong side of a transaction because additional sanctions get imposed. So a lot of banks, a lot of companies are just saying, we're not going to deal with Russian entities, period, because that's the prudent thing to do until we have a better idea of what's going to happen. So you're seeing that, and you're seeing that even in China, which is nominally an ally of Russia.
So let's talk about Beijing's surprise to how the world is reacting. You mentioned that if there was a global boycott of Beijing's goods, it would have a very different effect from Russia. So why is that? Why would there be such a big difference?
Well, because Russia is primarily an exporter of raw materials, which are converted then into goods, machinery, what have you. So the Russian component of a lot of those goods is much harder to define. I mean, a bottle of Russian vodka is unmistakably a Russian product. If Russian cobalt ends up in ball bearings that go into a car, that's obviously much harder to identify. China, on the other hand, is primarily, as far as their trade relations with the United States and Europe, really an exporter of consumer goods. I mean, they also export a lot of machinery and capital equipment and whatnot, but they produce a lot of consumer goods. I mean, Walmart is, I believe, China's sixth largest trading partner, just Walmart alone. So that tells you there's an enormous amount of consumer goods in Walmart that come from China, and the average retailer has a lot of goods that will say made in China. So if you have the same kind of development with a boycott of Chinese goods, which is certainly within the realm of possibility in the event that China invaded Taiwan. That would be a major problem for China because the export of consumer goods is a big chunk of their exports. It's a big chunk of the Chinese economy, and that would hurt.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Great. Thanks for having me.
That was Joe Micallef, historian and military analyst. And after the break, we hear from Andrew McCarthy, military intel analyst and Air Force veteran. He sheds light on why it's so hard to predict what Putin might do, the hybrid warfare playing out, and if world powers will shift. All that and more in just a minute.